In 1941, Adolf Hitler considered himself the smartest man in the world. He had conquered half of Europe. His armies seemed unstoppable. But it was precisely that confidence that marked the beginning of three fatal decisions that would bring about Germany's end. In his first decision, he underestimated his enemies. In his second decision, he chose the wrong allies. And in his third decision, he didn't even listen to his own generals. Each one seemed like a small step at first. But when these three decisions combined, they led to the deaths of millions, the destruction of cities, and ultimately, the collapse of Hitler's empire. In this video, we'll examine those three decisions one by one. And you'll see, sometimes a leader's greatest strength can become their own disaster. The summer of 1940 was Hitler's brightest moment. France had been defeated in 6 weeks. The world's most powerful army had collapsed against the German blitzkrieg. Paris was under occupation. The swastika was flying on the Eiffel Tower. Holland, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, all had fallen. Half of Europe was under Berlin's control. The Wehrmacht was unstoppable. And Hitler, looking at Paris from the balcony, felt invincible. But there was a problem. Britain. Churchill refused to make a ceasefire. The Royal Air Force was still resisting. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. And Britain was the last resistance in Europe. Hitler made a plan, Operation Barbarossa, to invade Britain. But for this, air superiority was needed first. The Luftwaffe had to destroy the RAF. Then the invasion could begin. July 1940, the Luftwaffe began attacking Britain. The target was to destroy the RAF's air bases and radar stations. The first weeks were successful. British air bases were damaged. Planes were grounded. But then Hitler made a mistake. He decided to bomb London. The RAF had shot down a German bomber over Berlin, and Hitler was enraged. He wanted revenge. He gave the order: attack civilian targets. September 1940, the London Blitz began. Every night, German planes bombed the city. Thousands of civilians were dying. But this was a strategic mistake, because it gave the RAF breathing room. Air bases were repaired, planes were reinforced, and by the end of September, the Luftwaffe began suffering heavy losses. The RAF was shooting down German bombers. Hitler couldn't gain air superiority. October 1940, Operation Barbarossa was postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived. Hitler couldn't defeat Britain, but didn't give up. Instead, he turned to another target: the Soviet Union. For years, he had been planning the idea of gaining territory in the East. And the Soviets were an ideological enemy. Communism was the opposite of Nazism. Hitler wanted to destroy Stalin. And at the end of 1940, he decided he would attack the Soviets in the spring of 1941. But this was a historic mistake, because Britain was still fighting. A two-front war was opening up. His generals warned, "Don't go east until the Western Front is finished." But Hitler didn't listen. He was overconfident. The Soviets were weak, their army was primitive, their leadership was poor. It could be finished in 6 months, or so he thought. That morning, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 aircraft. This was the largest invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The first days were disastrous for the Soviets. The German army advanced rapidly. The Red Army was in shock. Stalin hadn't believed Hitler would attack. He had ignored intelligence reports. Soviet air forces were destroyed on the ground. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk. Major cities fell one by one. By October, the German army was within 300 kilometers of Moscow. Hitler was jubilant. Victory was near. The Soviets were collapsing. But something was going wrong. The Soviets weren't surrendering. After each defeat, they were retreating but continuing to fight. Losses were massive, but resistance wasn't breaking. And then, nature intervened. November 1941, snow began to fall. The German army wasn't prepared for winter. Hitler had thought the war would be over in September. Soldiers were freezing in summer uniforms, tanks weren't working, fuel was freezing, and the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh units brought from Siberia attacked German lines. December 1941, the Wehrmacht retreated for the first time. The Moscow invasion failed. This was a psychological turning point. Because the Wehrmacht lost its myth of invincibility, German soldiers were in terror. The Russians weren't dying, winter was deadly, supply lines had collapsed. And worst of all, the war didn't seem to be ending. The second mistake: declaring war on America. December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was in shock. December 8th, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, but not on Germany. Hitler had caught a chance to choose. He could remain silent. America's entry into the European war wasn't guaranteed. The American people were isolationist. The Pacific Front was the priority. If Hitler had waited, maybe America would never have come to Europe. But Hitler didn't wait. December 11, 1941, Germany declared war on America. This was an incredibly foolish decision. Why did he do it? There were several reasons. Loyalty to Japan. The tripartite pact, Germany, Italy, Japan, was an alliance. Hitler thought Japan would keep America busy. Maybe America couldn't send troops to Europe. U-boat warfare. Hitler believed U-boats could paralyze America's east coast. Victory could be won in the Atlantic. Underestimation. Hitler saw America as weak. A mixed society, a democratic system, militarily inexperienced. Even the Soviets were more dangerous. But Hitler was wrong. Because America was the world's most powerful economy. Industrial capacity was massive. Population was 130 million. Resources were unlimited. And most importantly, America was now shifting into war economy at full speed. At the beginning of 1942, America's military power was limited. But within a year, everything changed. Factories were converted to war production. Automobile factories started producing tanks. Aircraft factories made bombers. The statistics were incredible. 1942, 47,000 aircraft produced. 43, 86,000 aircraft. 1944, 96,000 aircraft. Tanks, ships, weapons, all were produced in the millions. And these materials were sent to Britain and the Soviets. Thanks to the Lend-Lease program, the Allies were equipped with American equipment. The Soviets transported ammunition with American trucks. Britain bombed Germany with American planes. By 1943, America was producing one aircraft carrier every month. The number of tanks Germany produced throughout the entire war: 50,000. What America produced in 1943 alone: 29,000. This was industrial warfare, and America was crushing Germany. November 1942, American forces landed in North Africa. Operation Torch had begun. At first, they were inexperienced. Rommel repelled them at Kasserine Pass. But the Americans learned. They adapted quickly. Their equipment was superior. Their numbers increased. May 1943, Tunis fell. Rommel was recalled. The Africa Corps surrendered. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. This was a psychological blow, because Germany had suffered a large-scale defeat. The propaganda machine's invincible Wehrmacht rhetoric collapsed. And worse, now the Allies were preparing for Italy. The third mistake: refusing to retreat at Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Hitler planned a new offensive. Target: the Caucasus oil fields and the strategic city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. The plan made sense. Without oil, the Soviets couldn't fight. If Stalingrad was taken, the Volga would be cut. Supply lines would collapse. July 1942, Fall Blau, Blue Operation began. The first months were successful. The German army advanced south. Soviet resistance was broken. In August, the commander of the Sixth Army, General Friedrich Paulus, approached Stalingrad. Hitler gave the order: take the city. at all costs. But this wasn't a simple city battle. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. This was an ideological war. Two dictators would fight to the death for this city. September 1942, German forces entered Stalingrad. The city turned to rubble. Luftwaffe bombardments had destroyed everything. But the Soviets didn't surrender. The Soviet 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuikov's command, resisted frantically inside the city. The battle continued street by street. German soldiers were in terror. This was the bloodiest battle they had seen. A German soldier wrote in a letter, "This is hell. You take a building, but the Russians are still in the basement. You clear one room, but the enemy is in the next room. At night, the Russians counterattack. No one can sleep. No one is safe. This is a meat grinder." By November, the German 6th Army had captured 90% of the city. But the Soviets were still holding on the Volga riverbank. And then Stalin made his countermove. November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus. That morning, north and south of Stalingrad, massive Soviet forces attacked. Target: to encircle the German 6th Army. Operation Uranus had begun. Soviet tanks tore through German lines. Italian and Romanian units, German allies, collapsed. Within 5 days, the 6th Army was trapped in Stalingrad. 250,000 soldiers were besieged. Paulus sent a message to Hitler. "I request permission to retreat. Otherwise, the army will be destroyed." Hitler's answer was brief. "No, no retreat. Fight to the end. The Luftwaffe will supply you." This was the third and most deadly mistake, because the Luftwaffe couldn't adequately supply the besieged army. Weather was bad. Soviet air defense was strong. Every day 500 tons of food, ammunition, fuel were needed. But the Luftwaffe could only transport 100 tons. Soldiers began dying of starvation. December 1942, the German soldiers in Stalingrad were living through hell. There was no food. Horses were slaughtered. Leather boots were boiled. Typhus spread. Frostbite became widespread. Hundreds of soldiers were dying daily, not from battle, but from hunger and cold. Paulus pleaded again, "Please give permission to retreat." Hitler refused again. "If Stalingrad falls, we lose prestige. Hold on." End of December, a rescue operation was attempted, Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. General Erich von Manstein tried to reach the 6th Army with fresh units. He got within 50 kilometers, but Paulus couldn't break through the encirclement without Hitler's order. Manstein had to retreat. The rescue failed. January 1943, the Soviets made their final move. They tightened the Stalingrad encirclement. German forces were left without ammunition, without food, without morale. January 31st, Hitler made Paulus a field marshal. He sent a message. "No German field marshal has ever surrendered. Fight until death." But Paulus didn't want to kill his men anymore. February 2nd, 1943, he surrendered. The result was horrific. Of 250,000 German soldiers, only 91,000 surrendered. The rest died in battle or from starvation. And of these 91,000 prisoners, only 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. Stalingrad was a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. The loss of Stalingrad was the turning point of the war, because the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility was completely destroyed. Soviet morale rose, German morale collapsed. Even propaganda couldn't hide this. 3 days of mourning were declared in Berlin. And, strategically, Germany was now on the defensive on the Eastern Front. The retreat had begun. 1943 was a nightmare year for Germany. Barbarossa had turned into an endless war. America was crushing Europe with industrial power. Stalingrad had crippled the Wehrmacht. And now they were fighting on 3 fronts. Eastern Front. The Soviets had gone on the counter-offensive. The Battle of Kursk, July 1943, destroyed German tank units. Kiev, Kharkov. Cities were being recaptured one by one. Mediterranean Front. July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. Italy was collapsing. Mussolini was overthrown. Italy made a ceasefire. Germany now had to defend Italy too. Air war. British and American bombers were destroying Germany. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, cities turned to rubble. In 1943 alone, 40,000 civilians died in Hamburg. Hitler was in a three-front war. Resources were depleting, military numbers were decreasing, but he refused to retreat. "We will fight to the end," he said. 44. The Western Front opens. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies landed in Normandy. Hitler was expecting this attack, but had massed tanks in the wrong place. Enigma had been broken. He had been misinformed. The landing was successful. In August, Paris was liberated. In September, the Allies reached the German border. In the east, the Soviets were unstoppable. January 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. In 2 weeks, they crossed Poland, crossed the German border. In February, they were at the Oder River, only 60 kilometers from Berlin. In the west, the Allies crossed the Rhine River, encircled the Ruhr region. The collapse of a dictator. In April 1945, in the Berlin bunker, Hitler was looking at the map. But there was nothing left on the map. His armies were destroyed. Cities had turned to rubble. The Allies were at the door. His generals had long since fled or surrendered. Eva Braun had married him, one day before dying. April 30th, Hitler committed suicide with Eva. Their bodies were burned. His aides burned the body in the garden with gasoline. When Soviet soldiers arrived a few hours later, they found only burned remains. And thus, the founder of the Third Reich died in the hell he himself had created. A week later, May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over, but the legacy was horrific. 60 million people had died. Cities had turned to rubble. Germany was divided into 4 pieces, and it all stemmed from one man's decisions. Hitler's 3 decisions destroyed Germany. Operation Barbarossa, a 2-front war, suffocated Germany. The Soviets' power was underestimated. No winter preparation was made. The Wehrmacht was dragged into an endless war. Declaration of war on America. Making an enemy of the world's most powerful economy was like suicide. American industrial superiority crushed Germany. Stubbornness at Stalingrad. Refusing to retreat led to the deaths of 250,000 soldiers. The Wehrmacht's backbone was broken. The Eastern Front collapsed. Each of these decisions was devastating on its own. But when combined, they sealed Germany's fate. Because each one depleted Germany's resources, soldiers, morale. And Hitler learned from none of them. He was stubborn to the end, wrong to the end. If Barbarossa hadn't happened. Imagine, June 1941, Hitler doesn't attack the Soviets. Instead, he focuses on Britain. He controls the Mediterranean, Malta, Suez, Iranian oil. Maybe he makes a ceasefire with Britain. Churchill is overthrown. A peace-favoring government comes, and Germany consolidates its dominance in Europe. In this scenario, the war perhaps ends in 1942. Germany dominates most of Europe. The Soviets are distant. America hasn't intervened. The Cold War is between Germany and the Soviets. The course of history changes completely. But this didn't happen, because Hitler's ideology pulled him east. Lebensraum, anti-communism, racist ideology, all made the attack on the Soviets inevitable. Hitler was a prisoner of his ideology, and his ideology destroyed him. If war hadn't been declared on America. Imagine, December 1941, Hitler doesn't declare war on America. Pearl Harbor is an event in the Pacific. America is fighting Japan, but not coming to Europe. Britain is left alone. Lend-lease is limited. The Soviets don't receive American aid. In this scenario, the war becomes much harder. Maybe the Soviets slow down. Maybe Germany can establish a defensive line in 1943. Maybe the atomic bomb is dropped on Germany. Maybe the war ends in 1947. Or maybe an agreement is made. Europe is divided, Germany in the east, Soviets in the west. But this didn't happen either, because Hitler underestimated America. And making America an enemy was Germany's biggest strategic mistake if they had retreated at Stalingrad. Imagine, November 1942, Paulus gets permission to retreat. The Sixth Army breaks through the Soviet encirclement. There are losses, but the army is saved. The Wehrmacht reorganizes. They establish a defensive line. In this scenario, the Soviet offensive slows down. Maybe the Battle of Kursk goes differently. Maybe Germany holds in the east until 1944. Maybe D-Day fails. Maybe the war lasts longer. But this didn't happen either. Because Hitler feared losing prestige, and 250,000 soldiers became victims of his stubbornness. Hitler's psychology. Why did he make these mistakes? In 1940, Hitler seemed invincible. France had been defeated in 6 weeks. This had taken 4 years in World War I. Poland, Norway, Holland, all had fallen quickly. The Wehrmacht seemed like the most powerful army in history, and Hitler began to believe this was thanks to his own genius. But the reality was different. These victories were a combination of good planning, modern tactics, and enemy mistakes. Hitler's role was limited. His generals had made the plan. But after victory, Hitler began to see himself as a military genius. He ignored the general's advice. "I know," he said. And this arrogance led to disasters. Hitler's decisions weren't just military, they were ideological. Attacking the Soviets was part of the Lebensraum ideology. Destroying communism was Nazism's goal. He viewed Slavic peoples as inferior races and wanted to exterminate them. This ideological blindness prevented him from making rational decisions. For example, in Ukraine initially the Germans were welcomed as liberators because people wanted to escape Stalin's oppression. But Hitler viewed Ukrainians as slaves, massacres, starvation, oppression. As a result, Ukrainians returned to the Soviets and fought against the Germans. If Hitler had made the Ukrainians allies, maybe the Soviets would have collapsed. But his ideology didn't allow it. The people around Hitler said yes to him. Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, all were loyal Nazis but not military geniuses. Critics were fired or killed. Generals objected at first, but over time fell silent or retired. As a result, Hitler lived in a bubble. Real information was filtered. Bad news was hidden. Reports were turned positive. And Hitler didn't see reality. Even in 1945, in the bunker, he was moving imaginary armies on the map. Because no one was telling him the truth, Hitler refused to negotiate. In 1940, he could have made peace with Britain. In 1941, he could have made a ceasefire with the Soviets. In 1944, he could have made an agreement with the West. But each time he refused. No surrender, no retreat, victory or death, he said. This style looks strong in the short term. But in the long term, it's a disaster. Because war requires flexibility. Adapting to the situation, minimizing losses. But Hitler wasn't flexible, and this stubbornness destroyed Germany. Germany lost approximately 5 to 7 million soldiers in the war. This was 8 to 10% of the population. And not just soldiers, civilians died too. Allied bombardments killed 500,000, 600,000 civilians. During the Soviet advance, millions of Germans fled or were killed. Total German loss, 7 to 8 million people. But it's not just numbers. A generation was destroyed. Most men aged 18-30 died. Post-war Germany was filled with women, children, elderly. There were no men. And this demographic destruction lasted decades. 50% of Germany had turned to rubble. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne. Cities had been destroyed. Factories were bombed. Railways were cut. Ports had collapsed. In 1945, the German economy was zero. People were dying of starvation. The black market was the only economy, and worst of all, Germany was divided. East Germany came under Soviet control. A communist regime was established. West Germany was under Allied occupation. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 and stood until 1989. Germany's reunification occurred in 1990, 45 years after the war. Hitler's greatest crime was the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were systematically murdered. Concentration camps, gas chambers, mass graves, humanity's darkest moment. And Germany carries this legacy. Even today, Germany confronts this past. Monuments, museums, education programs, all to say, never again. The Holocaust was a crime not just against Jews, but against humanity. And Hitler's ideology made it possible. Racism, hatred, othering, these led to the decision to exterminate a people. And the result was history's greatest tragedy. Hitler's defeat made the Soviets a superpower. In 1945, the Red Army controlled most of Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all were under Soviet influence. And Stalin didn't withdraw. He established communist regimes. The Iron Curtain descended. The West became concerned. America stayed in Europe. NATO was founded 1949. Western Europe was rebuilt with the Marshall Plan. And the world was divided into two camps, capitalist West, communist East. The Cold War lasted until 1991. If Hitler hadn't attacked the Soviets, maybe the Soviets wouldn't have become so powerful. Maybe there would have been no Cold War. But Hitler's decisions shaped the world order. During the war, the Manhattan Project was launched. The atomic bomb was developed. August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. The nuclear age began, and throughout the Cold War, nuclear weapons determined the world's fate. An interesting alternate history. If Hitler had won, could Germany have developed the atomic bomb? German physicists, like Werner Heisenberg, were working on it. But Hitler didn't support nuclear research because he called it Jewish physics. Many Jewish scientists fled and joined the Manhattan Project in America. Irony, Hitler's racism sabotaged his own nuclear program. After the war, the United Nations was founded, 1945. Goal: never let such a war happen again. Human rights became universal. Genocide was defined as a war crime. The Nuremberg trials judged Nazi leaders. For the first time in history, war criminals were tried in an international court. This was the beginning of modern international law, and all of it was a reaction to what Hitler had done. The world said, "Never again," and tried to establish a new order. Hitler's story shows how dangerous dictatorship can be. One man, alone, decided on the deaths of millions. There were no checks and balances. Opposition was silenced. And the result was disaster. Democracies aren't perfect, but they're safer than dictatorships because power is shared. Decisions are discussed. When mistakes are made, they can be corrected. But in dictatorship, making a mistake means catastrophe. Hitler's ideology, racism, nationalism, Lebensraum, was disconnected from reality. Slavs weren't an inferior race. The Soviets weren't weak. Germany wasn't invincible. But ideology prevented him from seeing reality. Lesson: ideology can distort reality. Our beliefs can blind us. Critical thinking, accepting facts. These are vital. Otherwise, ideology drags us into the abyss. Early victories gave Hitler false confidence. He thought, "I am invincible." But the reality was luck and enemy mistakes. When he attacked the Soviets, luck ran out, and reality emerged mercilessly. Lesson: success can create arrogance, but arrogance is the beginning of downfall. Being humble, continuing to learn, admitting mistakes. These are the keys to long-term success. In Berlin's streets, traces of war still exist today. Bullet holes, monuments, museums. The Holocaust Memorial stands in the heart of the city. 2,111 concrete blocks, representing 6 million lost lives. And each block is a warning. Never again. Hitler's 3 decisions destroyed Germany. But not just Germany, Europe, the world. 60 million people died. Cities turned to rubble. A generation was lost. And it all stemmed from one man's arrogance, ideology, stubbornness. Does history repeat? Maybe. Dictators still exist. Ideological blindness still exists. Overconfidence still exists. But if we learn one lesson from Hitler's story, it's this: power requires responsibility. Ideology must be balanced with reality, and arrogance always leads to downfall. Hitler destroyed Germany with 3 decisions. But these decisions also changed the world. The Cold War, the United Nations, the nuclear age, all are consequences of these decisions. And today, 80 years later, we still live in the shadow of these decisions. History is a story written by the victors, but we tell what the losers experienced. Subscribe, discover with us the truths war forgot.